Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Funds for Food webinar, Global Food Insecurity, Taking the Long-Term View. To date, the Funds for Food event has raised nearly $2 million to combat food insecurity globally. My name is Kate Reed, and I'm the chair of the Charity Committee for the Funds for Food event. The role of the Charity Committee was to choose the charities the event was going to support. We chose 9 very different charities who all tackle food insecurity, but do so in very different ways, from food redistribution, disaster relief, to community centres and education. These charities work tirelessly to provide good, healthy food to those in need. I'm delighted that 3 of our charity partners, the Felix Project, World Central Kitchen and Feeding America, along with Olga Nefedova from McKinsey, are here tonight to discuss the work they do and how they've responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our moderator this evening is Bloomberg's Global Food Czar and Agricultural Editor, Millie Munshi. Now, before I hand over to Millie, a bit of housekeeping. There is a Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. Please do submit some questions and we will try and answer them in the session. And then finally, if you would like to make a donation, please visit the Funds for Food website, www.fundsforfood.com, and click on the Donate Now button. 100% of your donations will go to these amazing charities and really will make a difference. I'll now hand you over to Millie to start the panel. Thank you.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Millie Munshi. I'm the Global Food Czar at Bloomberg News. And before we get into our panel today, I'm going to do a small presentation to help bring in some context and background for today's themes. When it comes to global food insecurity, we are actually in a time of deepening crisis. The UN estimates that about 820 million people are currently experiencing malnourishment around the world. This figure has increased since 2011, and that's happened at a time when the broader world economy has experienced growth. When it comes to malnourishment, there's a very broad category of what is involved. In some developing countries, this may mean that people literally do not have enough to eat. They are going without and skipping meals. In the developed world, the picture may look different. People are consuming enough calories to meet their daily needs, but the types of food that they are eating could be leaving them malnourished, meaning they aren't getting the right mix of healthy fruits and vegetables, and they are not getting the vitamins and minerals they need. COVID-19 is making this food crisis worse. Those facing acute food insecurity, one of the most severe levels of insecurity, are projected to double this year to 265 million. And there are a number of reasons for this. There's the broader economic downturn. Millions are being thrown out of work, reducing people's purchasing power. There's also a drop in global remittance flows. There's the pandemic, which is keeping people off the road, and that's having a severe impact on oil demand. So cash coming into countries relying on crude exports is falling. And this is also adding to ongoing problems of conflict and climate change. Now, all this is happening at a time when the world is producing more than enough food. Global rice production is supposed to reach a record all-time high, and wheat inventories are also ample. Together, rice and wheat account for about 1/3 of the world's calories. So this underscores a very basic point. There's plenty of food in the world, but it's not always getting where it's needed. This will continue to be a challenge as we look beyond the pandemic and think about the 10 to 50-year outlook. Some of the themes that we're seeing now will carry over for the next several decades unless something is done now to severely alter the direction that things are headed. One of the key obstacles in coming decades will be climate change. Climate change has made it more difficult to grow crops in many areas. Take, for example, wheat in Europe, which has seen drought and severe heat. That has a severe impact on countries that are already dependent on food imports. And climate change is, of course, linked to natural disasters, which upends normal food production and supply chains. Some of the supply chain problems that we've seen during the pandemic, the reason that you've seen empty grocery store shelves in a place like New Jersey, could be repeated during natural disaster times. Food waste is another major symptom of the problem in the system. The UN estimates that about 1/3 of all the food that's produced in the world is either lost or wasted each year. That's currently about 1.3 billion tons of food. And if steps aren't taken to change current behavior, the problem is projected to get worse. Asia alone could see 1 billion tons of food waste by 2050. Strengthening supply chains, eliminating food waste, and working to redistribute that food can be a key part of helping to bridge the gap for millions around the world who are facing food insecurity. And that's where today's organizations that are being featured on the panel can play a crucial role. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel members today. First on the panel is Nate Mook, the CEO of World Central Kitchen. World Central Kitchen is focused on providing meals in the wake of natural disasters, and the group is also working to build food resiliency in supply chains around the world. Jane Byam is the founder of the Felix Project. The Felix Project is a London-based organization focused on saving surplus food from going to waste. They are working to redistribute supplies where they are needed. Olga Nefedova is an expert associate partner at McKinsey & Co. Her main focus has been on serving financial institutions and service organizations, and she's helped to design and implement large-scale transformations. Olga has been working with the Felix Project since January 2019 and has helped them to develop their growth strategy. And finally, Denise Thomas is a board member for Feeding America. Feeding America is the largest hunger relief nonprofit organization in the US. The group helps to feed more than 46 million people through its system of food pantries, soup kitchens, shelters, and other community programs. Denise's work in Feeding America is focused on the Milwaukee area. So thank you very much to our panel members. We really appreciate you being here today. And I will now yield the floor to each of you to introduce yourselves and your organization for about a minute each. And we'll start with Nate. Thank you, Nate.
Thanks so much for having me. So I'm Nate. I'm the CEO of World Central Kitchen. We're an organization focused on empowering and uplifting communities through food. One of the things that we do is we respond after disasters, during crises, to make sure that families, communities have access to fresh, healthy food. So we usually find ourselves after hurricanes or earthquakes or wildfires responding. And now we find ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic. So we're working hard here in the United States and around the world. And over the past 3.5 months, we've served about 20 million meals, fresh meals, in response to the pandemic.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Nate. Jane, would you like to talk a little bit about the Felix Project?
Yes, thank you so much. So we are a London-based, fairly young charity. We set up in April 2016, so we're just over 4 years old. We started with 1 van and 1 employee, and since then we've had the most amazing amount of support and exponential growth, so much so that last year we redistributed the equivalent of 6.5 million meals. We rescue and redistribute food that can't be sold by all sorts of suppliers in the commercial food sector, supermarkets and wholesalers. And our clients are hundreds of frontline charities across London who are serving all kinds of people in need. And we have a hunger crisis here in London at the moment, and we are determined to keep our exponential growth going and accelerated.
Great. Thanks so much, Jane. Olga, would you like to talk about how you've worked with the Felix Project?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. As everyone else who ever comes across Felix Project, I got very inspired by the mission and the story, and we mobilized a lot of colleagues in our London office. We support many charities in London, but this one is the most favorite one, wholeheartedly voted by the colleagues. I started working with the team, with Jane and the other board members, and now with the executive team of the Felix Project, helping to really understand what constitutes demand in the context of food poverty in a developed country, in a city like London, very wealthy city, but we still have a lot of people that fall into that bracket, and understanding what's the most effective and efficient way of reaching that demand, delivering food to them. So I've been working with the team to solve this problem, to find innovative and maybe technology enabled unlocks that would help us support the growth that there is the ambitions that Jane just shared.
Great, thank you so much, Olga. And Denise, would you like to introduce yourself and speak about Feeding America?
Yes, thank you first, Millie, so much for having us. And as you had mentioned, Feeding America is a nationwide network of 200 food banks that serve over 40 million Americans, including 12 million children and 7 million seniors. In particular, Feeding America Eastern Wisconsin is a food bank that is one of the largest, or the largest, hunger relief organization in Wisconsin. And in particular, we are serving about 1 million people of the urban population in Milwaukee. One of our biggest focuses, just based on the demographics and makes up of Milwaukee, is inequity and hunger. And one of the things that I will definitely be excited to share and to further discuss is how the coronavirus, in addition to the existing inequities regarding health disparities, access to food, the impact of having healthy food, as you had mentioned, is our areas of focus within Feeding America Eastern Wisconsin.
Wonderful, thanks very much, Denise. Jane, I'd like to throw a question to you. I know in our pre-panel discussion, one of the things that you mentioned was the number of new people that you've seen who have been needing food assistance during this pandemic time, and how that's a signal to you about the prolonged nature of the crisis that we're in. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that.
Well, absolutely. We are framing our thinking now that this crisis and the aftermath is going to be a minimum of 3 years. And so we're scaling up to be a crisis operation for 3 years. Just last night on the BBC Main News, they featured a guy who had no access to any kind of public funding. He couldn't access the furlough scheme, which is actually, it's protecting the UK at the moment from the worst consequences, but it's going to come to an end fairly soon. He was really suffering. And we've seen, I'm interested to hear you talk about developing countries. There have been millions of people across the country who are actually missing meals, skipping meals, and reducing their portions. And so they are not actually getting the basic calories that they need. As I said, we work with hundreds of charities. They've seen their demand and the number of people they're serving go up threefold, tenfold, depending where they are. And we've set up a whole new operation, which is delivering directly to the 33 London boroughs. So we've completely changed our operation in the last few weeks. We joke that we've done about 2 years development in 3 weeks, which happened in a very intense period in April or May or so. Nationally and in London, the inequality is striking. It's this pandemic is striking those who were already struggling much harder. So a quarter of families with children across the country are reporting difficulties, and a third of the people who are affected by poverty and struggling to access food are 16 to 24-year-olds. Yeah, we're seeing this as a big social crisis where it's only just beginning to unfold. You only had to look at the Times this morning. There were 10,000 jobs lost in 2 days, and it's big names that we all know. It's unfolding before our eyes. But the good news is that last week we had our record ever day. We received 48 tons of food that was surplus, that couldn't be sold and might otherwise have been at risk of ending up in landfill or anaerobic digestion. And we had demand for that. We got it all out on the same day. And that's to me a measure of how hard we're working, and that we do have a system that could help London.
That's wonderful. That's a great amount of food to be redistributed.
So there's still plenty of surplus food. That may change, but we haven't seen a sign of it yet. We did have a brief period when we were worried we weren't going to get enough surplus food and didn't know where the food was going to come from. But there's another point I wanted to make, which was because we have so many volunteers and most of our labour is free, that we calculate we're delivering approximately £12 of food at retail value for every pound of cost that we have.
Wow.
So we think we're delivering amazing value for an efficiency And that's something that really speaks to our donors and that they really appreciate. And it's one of the measures of how powerful this model can be, I think.
Wow, thanks a lot, Jane. That's really great insights. And Denise, I know that you are also in a developed country and seeing some similar themes of food crisis and the heightening needs under the pandemic. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of both the need and what you were mentioning about the need for access to the right mix of healthy foods.
Yes, and I just want to underscore what Jane had mentioned is that we have to understand that hunger and inequity across the world was already in existence. Mm-hmm. And when you think about the systemic racism approaches that have really had a negative impact already, now when you think about what COVID-19 has done, it has really furthered our opportunity to focus on, again, the health disparities that are related to hunger. So for example, when you look at Milwaukee is what is known as a majority minority city, which basically means that the majority of people in Milwaukee are people of color. Mm-hmm. And in particular, African-American populations are already suffering from, when you think about the US, 10% of the United States suffers from type 2 diabetes. However, 60% of the African-American population are suffering from type 2 diabetes. So much higher than white Americans. One of the efforts that Feed America is doing is focusing on, through our food banks, in particular in Milwaukee, is focusing on the access to not just food, but to healthy food. Because as you had mentioned, Millie, it's about making sure that the food that you're consuming on a daily basis is providing the nutrients that you have. And quite frankly, people of color, especially in areas, urban areas such as Milwaukee, just do not have access to those wages, to reliable jobs, and have fewer assets. And so it is something that, again, has now amplified because of COVID-19. And I really want to commend Patty Habeck and her amazing team at Feed America Eastern Wisconsin, because one of the efforts that her team immediately addressed was keeping the volunteers and keeping the staff healthy in response to the immediate need or the increased need of access to food and healthy food at that. So again, what I really want folks to understand that are in this room is that solving hunger is definitely critical. In addition to solving hunger, we also have to make sure that we're addressing the inequities that are perpetuated by holding back access and healthy foods to those underserved communities.
Yes, really, really great insights there. And I think a really important topic. And I think we'll return to some of those questions as we kind of continue our panel, but thank you a lot, Denise. And Nate, I know that at World Central Kitchen, one of the programs that you've developed during the pandemic era is this restaurant program, which has been very key to both actually getting people food and healthy food, as Denise mentioned, but also keeping supply chains going. And I was wondering if you could sort of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is a very unique type of disaster for the planet, but especially for the United States. As a country, I think we're very used to responding to disasters, to emergencies in specific geographical locations, right? So a hurricane hits Florida, we mobilize a lot of resources and food, and we bring in trucks and we bring everything into one place, right? You can't do that with the pandemic, right? Because it's impacting everywhere. It's in the big cities, it's in the small towns, it's, it doesn't spare anyone. And, as Denise mentioned, and in these most vulnerable areas, it's hitting especially hard. So, our typical model of response, how our country responds to emergencies, has broken down. Also, we've seen as has been mentioned, not only here in the United States, but also in the UK, the supply chain starts to break down as well, because, the businesses are closed, the restaurants are closed, they're not buying from the farmers, the food banks are struggling to handle, all of the demand that's on them. And so we sort of took a step back and said, how can we rethink our approach? World Central Kitchen, we typically set up these big, massive kitchens where we're preparing, 50, 100,000 meals out of. We've got systems to get food delivered to places, but that's very centralized. So how do we rethink the model a little bit and look at a way to do this in a distributed nature? The other piece of this is that, in a typical disaster, the infrastructure is impacted, right? The electricity's out, the water's out, something has gone wrong that has broken down the typical systems of food access or food support structures that are in existence. In this case, with the pandemic, with COVID, the infrastructure is actually perfectly fine, right? The electricity is not out, the water is not out. It's actually, it's one of a health issue and an economic issue. Mm-hmm. So we sort of put all these things together and we said, World Central Kitchen can't be everywhere, but what is everywhere are restaurants in every town and every city across this country. So how can we be smart about this and activate those restaurants to turn into community kitchens for feeding those that are in need? Mm-hmm. And this model isn't to replace the incredible work being done by food banks or other nonprofits, which is all super important, but rather, we look at this as a very complementary solution, right? Right now, the need is so great that we kind of need everything coming together to respond, and every solution has a role, but we can't put it on individual, organizations. Food banks can't handle all of the need right now. Nonprofits doing food rescue work can't handle all of the need right now. We need everybody coming together. So what we thought was, how do we activate the private sector to go to work, to provide meals within their communities? So we set up this program, Restaurants for the People. We've activated so far about 2,300 restaurants all across the country. We pay those restaurants to produce meals, and these are restaurants that we're offline. We're not functioning because of the pandemic, because restaurants have been closed. Maybe some of them have been doing takeout, but certainly not up to their normal business. So we agree, we work with them to pay them to produce meals. And we do this while keeping a focus on the health and safety. As was mentioned, this really has to be a priority. World Central Kitchen has been responding to COVID before it was COVID. Back in early February, we were out in Japan setting up a food system for the quarantine cruise ship. So we had to completely redevelop our health and safety protocols in the kitchen and beyond, and with food delivery, to make sure everybody stays safe. So we've now been able to share those protocols with the restaurants that we are working with to make sure that everybody stays safe during this time. So in the process, we've been able to activate these restaurants, put them back to work. They've been able to keep their staff employed. They've been able to pay their rent to keep their business going, which is super important. And they've also been able to continue to buy from their local suppliers. So we aren't going in and telling them what to cook, what to make, who to buy from. We just tell them, here's what the needs are, and working with local community-based organizations on the ground to link those restaurants with the need and create that bridge. Those restaurants can then start to prepare those meals, keep buying from their local suppliers, who then buy from their local farmers, and we keep that sort of economic engine going, right? Which is so critical right now. So it's not a solution forever. It's a solution that really is intended to be a bridge during this really difficult time, and be smart about the dollars that we're putting back into responding to the crisis. So far to date, we've been able to put back over $60 million directly into the hands of small and independent restaurants. And we've heard directly the impacts that that's been having on the ground to keeping people employed, keeping more folks needing food. Right now, we have well over, I think, 45 million Americans out of work. At the end of July, many will lose their unemployment benefits. And that is going to be a huge burden on our society, because people simply aren't going to be able to afford to put food on the table for their families. And so this is one solution, one approach that we're taking that we think could be a smart way, because every dollar that goes into it really has this multiplier effect, which, as Jane mentioned, is so important right now.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much for all that insight. I think one of the things that really struck me about this program at World Central Kitchen with the restaurants is how you've been able to maintain supply chains. I think for a lot of us, some of the most unsettling images during this pandemic when it comes to food has been seeing pictures of things like dumped milk, smashed eggs, farmers who have had to plow over crops such as broccoli. There's just been a tremendous amount of food waste on the supplier end, which is a little bit different than normal times. In normal times, we do see a lot of food waste, but especially in a place like the US and the UK, a lot of that food waste comes further down the supply chain, not necessarily among producers. So being able to keep those supply chains going is a key part of this. And I see that we have a question from our audience about food waste. And the question is, how can we educate the next generation about food waste? I wonder if either Olga or Jane, working through the Felix Project, you would want to talk about that issue. Go ahead, Jane.
Well, one of our main activity streams is supplying food to 120 of primary schools. So that's age sort of 4 to 11 years old in the most deprived parts of London. And as part of that program, when we bring a school on board, we go and do a whole school assembly, we call it. So it's like a sort of lecture and Q&A with the whole school, where we tell them about food waste and also about nutrition and the importance of balanced diets and the right kind of calories, fruit and vegetables. But and then we have a market stall set up in the playground once or twice a week, where all the kids and their families can come and get fresh fruit and vegetables, fantastic baked goods, and some treats, as well as recipes if they need to take them home. So this way we access the whole family. But we found early on that we had to make sure that the messaging was all to do with stopping food waste and saving the planet, so to remove the stigma of being in need of food. So the message is, please take this food, because otherwise it would go to waste with all the terrible effects it has on climate change and so on. So this is one, and the kids are really responding to it. So are their families, and they're excited about it and really keen to be part of the scheme, rather than it being seen as something which has a stigma. And the messages we think are getting through to them about fantastic fruit and vegetables, how you use them, how you cook them, how delicious they are, even if they're unfamiliar, and also the message about climate change. So that's what we're doing. And these schools, even though many of them have had their doors closed for most pupils, they've carried on operating the Felix market stalls in the playgrounds, and they've become sort of community centers. So the families still receive the same amount of food, because we still had to keep food moving through the system. So the schools themselves, many of them have become like local community centers.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jane. Olga, I was wondering maybe you'd want to field this next question that comes from an audience member. I know that you and I have talked about distribution being a key part of this whole equation of how a project like the Felix Project needs to increase its distribution. And we've got a question in from the audience that says, besides funding, what are organizations, what are they seeing as their biggest logistical challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the questions that we battled with for a few months now with the team of the Felix Project. When you look at the, we talk about food waste, it seems like the food supply is not going to cease very, very quickly, right? So it's going to be there. And when we talk about demand and people in need of food, I mean, after COVID, it's going to increase even further. So where are the challenges between connecting this food and the people who really need it? I think what we observed in the biggest unlock would be definitely in technology. Felix Project employs a lot of volunteers. It's a large army of people who come in every day, and they work tirelessly in the warehouse, and they sort food and they deliver food. But they don't deliver it to the door of the exact volunteer, right? So you cannot possibly kind of hand it to every person who is in need. So building the very robust infrastructure to deliver food still has one problem to solve. And I think this is a very similar problem to any retail business, any service business that is now struggling. It's a last mile delivery, right? What do you do to hand the food? So far, there is many organizations in every borough in London that perform this role. But as we raise the volume and the demand is growing, that will become, the infrastructure will become the bottleneck, and we will have to probably somehow partner and cooperate with the tech companies who develop solutions. I won't name them, but there are many solutions that are already available, and everyone is solving this problem, because you cannot be, even in commercial world, you cannot be successful without solving this problem. Otherwise, it will make your product very, very expensive if you haven't solved last mile delivery. So that would be my answer.
Okay, great. Would anyone else like to speak to this question of logistical challenges before we move on?
Millie, don't be mad at me. I actually wanted to piggyback off of what Jane was speaking about.
Please do.
And so one of the questions was, how do we educate the next generation regarding health disparities? And I really want to focus on the power of meeting people where they are. So part of Feeding America, Eastern Wisconsin, has been very intentional and deliberate about the relationships that we cultivate with different corporations at both a large and small scale. And part of those relationships is encouraging donors to come to the food banks to learn more about the food disparities. And I really want to encourage the next generation, because they are already doing a tremendous job as it relates to social issues to, again, foster those relationships. Feeding America has over 200 food banks across the country. And so there has to be, in some type of proximity, a food bank within Feeding America that you could access. And again, start to ask the questions. It's one thing, and I'm not discounting the power of making monetary donations, but we as humans across the world, what we have to do a better job of is becoming more educated through the power of relationships and meeting these underserved communities where they are. Because remember, and this goes back to what Nate was talking about, one of the essential components of supply chain is distribution, but it's only as effective as my access to the distribution. So if it indeed requires volunteers to learn more about the process of supply chain and meeting those individuals where they are, that in itself helps alleviate a lot of the problems that are associated with having access. So again, I would encourage the incoming generation to continue to leverage their focus and their centric on social issues, and build relationships with the food banks and build relationships with individuals who represent the underserved communities.
Yes, that's great. Thank you for jumping in with that. Really appreciate it. Nate, we've got a question for you from the audience. It says, Nate, you mentioned the system of private charities working alongside food banks and working all together for now to cover the emergency. How do you see the different initiatives carrying on the mission in an efficient way?
Yeah, I think this pandemic has been something that is larger than all of us. And I think it also has really spotlighted the importance of local leadership, right? There is no national solution. The federal government has not swooped in to solve the problems, right? I mean, if you look at really what's working right now, it is the local on the ground leadership. And as Denise mentioned, this goes from regional all the way down to the neighborhood level. It is so critical right now, because if not, there would be a vacuum. And so I think, what has been so important here is that it is a system of collaboration where we, as different organizations doing different type of work, can communicate, can understand what each group is doing on the ground, can see where there's areas to bring that together. We're seeing this work very well in a lot of places. I'll give you a few examples. in New York City, we're working very closely with the Food Bank for New York City. We, as World Central Kitchen, we're preparing fresh prepared meals. So these are meals that are already either ready to eat or can be taken home and just heated up in a microwave or something. The Food Bank is distributing fresh products as well, like in boxes that can be taken home for families. And all of these, things serve a great purpose because not everybody has the ability to prepare fresh meals from scratch. We have a lot of seniors that have been forced to isolate because of COVID. These are seniors that maybe typically get meals at senior centers. They don't have the ability or the equipment to cook meals fresh every single night. You have families that are working and they don't have the time and energy to prepare meals. So a combination of things works really well. And then these hubs for distribution become central focal points for the communities. And you can be distributing other items that communities need at these locations as well. So that could be, materials for children who are out of school. It could be, other types of things that families need right now, diapers and other, and other just general needs that folks are needing during this critical time. Another great example of this is the schools. I think this pandemic has really highlighted the importance of schools, not just for educating our children, but also for feeding our children. It's been a wake-up call because all of a sudden, all across the country and all across the world, schools shutting down have not just meant our kids are going to struggle to get an education, it means our kids are going to struggle to eat. And it's not clear what's going to happen in the fall. It is clear that schools are not going to be able to reopen as they were before. And so, it really highlights the importance of thinking about schools as community hubs for distribution of food, of other items. And so I think, all of this is really going to hopefully leave a lasting impact and change the way that we all think about charity and the way that we approach this work. Too often, I think all of our organizations are so focused on what we do that we can work in silos sometimes. And this situation has, because there is no other choice, has forced us all to work together. So I think it is going to fundamentally change a lot of how the way private nonprofits work with public school systems, that work with the city leadership, community leadership, down to the city council, to local officials, and have to come together for this. So I think we're seeing there's some great stories, and we hear a lot about the bad stories out there, right? About because there's a lot of work to do, right? And food waste and what's happening with our food supply chain is a big one, and we have a lot of work to do for the long term. But there's also amazing stories going on the ground of work being done to support our communities. And I think it's a testament to how we are getting through this. It's not easy, but we're getting through this not because of some sort of national program or national leadership. We're getting through it because of those community-based organizations on the ground, the local food banks, the local private charities, and this sort of collaboration that we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you, Nate. I think that's a really important thing to bring out is what are the success stories and how are we building those chains of relationships? That's very insightful. Thank you. And just bouncing off of that, Olga, I know that one of the things that you've really stressed is that how organizations like World Central Kitchen, Feeding America, Felix Project, they actually play a crucial role for people who don't have the social networks that are needed to help people see through difficult times. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could jump or should I wait? Because indeed, building on the points that Denise mentioned and Nate just spoke now, I think it's, the primary purpose of those communities is to deliver, right? You're using them as supply chain, but what we don't always see is that they actually work as a social network. And there was a few studies in US actually about how is it possible that people are so close to wealth and yet they can't just reach out. What happens? Why they go, why they fall? And apparently what happens is that if you have a network of your relatives, your friends, and something bad happens to you, you bounce back. Your network will push you back. But there are people who don't have this safety net, and if something happens, they just keep falling, right? And there is nothing that will pull them back. They don't have it. Sometimes it's people with sort of with mental health issues. Sometimes it's foreigners who just didn't grow in this place, and those community gatherings, those community networks that Felix Project, that all those charities that bring together, they actually create that network. And it not only helps to fill your immediate need, it actually could change the life and the life of the family and the future of the children. Just creating this, the safety net, the network that gives you purpose, that supports you, and you need to bounce back when something happens.
Yes, I think that's a really crucial underlying reason that we should all think about is these, social safety nets, and how do we recreate those social safety nets for people who don't have them. To me, one of the most striking things about this is that we're in a time right now where the pandemic has really sharpened up the inequities that exist in the world. And when it comes to inequity, I think there's nothing more stark than being food insecure. It's a matter of basically, wellness and not wellness. And I think, one of the questions that's come in from the audience is, how much political awareness do you think there is of food insecurity? And I know, Denise, you and I have talked a little bit about how this question of food insecurity relates and intersects to the bigger political questions and social and societal questions going on right now when it comes to racial injustice and systemic inequalities, both in the US, but we've seen people around the world take these issues up. And I was wondering if you could sort of speak to that a little bit.
Sure. So to answer the question, how much political awareness do I think there is of food insecurity? The answer is not enough. One of the things that we have to do as American citizens, and in particular voters, is hold our elected officials accountable for food insecurities in this country. And so to have awareness is one thing, which I truly believe that every person on earth realizes that out of all the decisions that we have to make every day, there are a significant number of individuals that have to decide, do I pay my rent or do I feed my family? So the awareness is not the issue. It's the accountability opportunity in terms of, again, working with your local food banks, and in particular Feeding America, and making sure that we have relationships with existing elected officials and those that are running for office, and say, what do you plan to do to ensure that state representatives, local legislations, bills are specifically addressing underserved communities, people who do not have access. And one thing I want to build off of what Nate had talked about. We talk about the significance of underserved communities and systemic issues as it relates to race. And I really want to underscore that this is about humanity. This is about humanity. And if you can't think about the significance of waking up in the morning, and again, based on all the decisions that we have to make, how am I going to eat today? That is just, again, the awareness alone is there. Also, there's another question that was asking about benefits from cross-border organizational coordination. That goes back again with holding our elected officials accountable. There's been previous administrations. So for example, under the Obama administration, former First Lady Michelle Obama had a huge initiative around gardening, putting gardens in your backyard, having community gardens where you could get food safely and have access to healthy food. So again, we have to make sure that we are holding our elected officials accountable. So the political awareness, it's there. The accountability is the opportunity.
Very interesting. And Jane, how do you see this issue as being somebody on the other side of the pond, as we say?
Well, things could be better, but I have to say I've got some good news stories from both central and local government. First of all, from London itself. I mean, I think what London has done is extraordinary. So within weeks, all 33 London boroughs had come together to agree a hub system of they would take over the responsibility for the final mile for getting food to isolating people and kids who are no longer getting free school meals. And we re-engineered our service to have a big focus on getting food in bulk to those 33 and more central food hubs for each borough. And it really encouraged collaboration between the Felix Project and the two other fairly similar food redistribution charities in London. And for the first time, we are working as one in the London Food Alliance. And I think that amount of cooperation has been extraordinary at a local level. And the Mayor of London has also really helped make it happen. In central government, we had our first central government funding last year. And the Conservative government has got the most extraordinary person who is food czar for food waste and food redistribution. He's an extraordinarily compassionate and energetic man. He's driven so much fundraising for us and for other charities, and he really feels the need and communicates it in the most extraordinary way. He absolutely has empathy, and he you know, himself, he has a massive political will to change things and make sure kids don't go to school hungry. When he found that out, and when we exposed the problem to him, you could just see him go into action. So we are seeing government response. It could be better and it must continue, but we've got capital funding and potentially some some funding in the background should we need it. So we have felt supported, and we felt there is government recognition of the problem.
Yeah, I'll add as well. I think that this is a moment where I hope if there is something good to come out of this, that the awareness, as Denise said, is there. People are seeing this firsthand, unless they're sticking their head in the sand. You know, it's not hard. You know, you can come to a World Central Kitchen site in Queens every day and see lines wrapping around the block, families lining up at 4:30 in the morning, waiting for 7.5 hours until we start serving meals, because it's maybe the only food that they have access to, and they need to get this food for their family to keep them going. There's no hiding anymore. Too often, food insecurity lives, you know, is hidden away in marginalized communities. It's sort of, you know, swept under the rug as you know, a welfare issue and not something that is core. So I'm hopeful that we can use this moment in time to put the pressure on leadership, look at the flaws in the system as they exist now, and try to repair those flaws, because they are systemic. You know, in the United States, we have a Department of Agriculture. We do not have a Department of Food. And those are two different things with different priorities. When you look at FEMA, our Federal Emergency Management Agency, they have been supporting some feeding efforts around the country, as they do in other types of disasters. But the way that it works is they have a cost share. So the federal government will only cover the cost of 75% typically, and the states or the cities, the local counties, will be on the hook for 25%. So as you can imagine, this really disincentivizes more impoverished areas from participating in these federal programs, because they simply don't have the money to cover that 25% cost share. California rolled out a program for feeding seniors and members in the community who didn't have access to food. What we saw in California was that more wealthier counties, places like Santa Clara and Los Angeles and San Francisco, were able to participate in these programs. Unfortunately, areas where folks are at much lower income, the cities and the counties don't have as much money, they simply couldn't take on that burden. So then you've got places that are wealthy that are able to feed their communities in need, and you have other areas that need the food the most that simply can't exercise and can't access this food, and they're not able to take advantage of this. And so this sort of systemic problem needs to be addressed. And so we're hopeful. World Central Kitchen, we've We've helped put a bill into the House and the Senate that we're calling the FEED Act. One of the things it does is it takes away this 25% burden and says the government should be able to pay the full amount to feed our citizens. It should also be able to put money into local restaurants and local farmers to keep those dollars in those communities. And so there's a lot of work to do. We got to keep up the pressure. But as Jane said, I mean, I think in the United States as well, there is some political momentum now. There are some good things happening. So it's really on us to keep that going.
Great. Thanks very much, Nate. We just got a great question from the audience. And I'll open it up to whichever panel member feels they want to tackle this, or maybe more than one of you. But we're looking for an answer to, if somebody can speak to, why is it that people fall through the social safety nets provided through government programs? And instead they need to access things like food banks and other private food assistance programs.
I would say, if I may answer just the first part of it, I think from what I witnessed, all these programs are wonderful and they really help, but there is still a degree of bureaucracy in them. So you really have to go after something if you need help. And a lot of people don't have the stamina, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have friends who would tell them what to do. So they just don't go after this money, and the system is not designed to go and seek for people who needs help. So that's how they fall through. And I think that's as simple as that.
Yeah, I'm learning all the time. We're building the charity. I didn't know until just recently that we have 1 million people who have what is called no recourse to public benefit, NRPF for short. And there are 1 million people who fall into this category. They maybe have just become unemployed. Our universal credit system is quite hard to access, and there's a long lag before you might actually get your first payments. And there are all sorts of ways that people find they just don't qualify for public benefits. Mm. And these are the people who are literally going hungry and who are totally dependent on food banks and other local charities.
I had to pause. I had to pause for a second because that question triggered basically one of the core reasons of why I joined the board of directors of Feed America is just because of that. Government programs are systemically inadequate when you think about the amount that you're receiving based on the number of mouths that you have to feed and based on the cost associated with driving to the supermarket, buying food in the supermarket. So that in itself is an inequity. So when you think about how people that are dependent, and I use that word, strongly dependent on government programs, but still end up having to use food banks, that goes back to the original question of holding our elected officials accountable. And as Nate had mentioned, why do we not have a Department of Food? Because it is inadequate. It's not fair. That's a red flag. And so if I'm receiving, let's say, $1,000 a month, and I've got 4 mouths to feed, and there's a process in terms of the supply chain of getting to the supermarket, that in itself, again, goes back to, do I pay my rent or do I feed my family? So that in itself right there is a great question. And it's also a great opportunity for us to start again, having those conversations with our elected officials, both at the national, state, and local levels. Why are people dependent on government programs, but yet still need access to food banks? Mm-hmm. Great question.
That's great. And I think what you're bringing up, Denise, because we're getting toward the end of the hour here, it went really fast.
Oh no, I want to talk till midnight.
No, that's, I was piggybacking off of what you said about keeping these conversations going. And I'd like, basically if each panel member could take maybe 30 seconds to talk about how they see the importance of this, because I think there's been a lot of awareness raised in the height of this crisis. But of course, this is not something that's going away anytime soon. So how do we keep this conversation going? We want to start with Jane and kind of go around the room.
Well, one massive lever we have had at the Felix Project in London is that we've had the benefit of the interest of the London Evening Standard, which is one of London's leading media outlets. They have taken such an interest in the issues, and every day there are stories about people who are charities who are looking after people who are struggling, which people are struggling and why, and also why people volunteer and give their time, and how amazingly satisfying it is to play your part in helping other people. And that's just been fantastic. The media have to get involved and realize these stories are fascinating for people and they're well worth looking into.
Great, thanks. We'll head to Nate.
Yeah, I think that, we don't really know what the weeks ahead are going to bring, but I think one of the clear signs that is now emerging is that, as Jane mentioned, I mean, this is going to be a very long recovery. If we can even consider this a recovery yet. I mean, we're still in the middle of it, and especially in the United States. I mean, Europe's doing a little bit better, but the United States is not in good shape right now. And I think we need to start taking a long view on this. I think one of the most important things is that the importance of philanthropy and donors is critical at jumpstarting and galvanizing and moving a response very quickly, right? Philanthropic dollars, private sector dollars, donations help us move super fast and get things to where they need to go. But they can't sustain for the long term, right? I mean, it's not feasible. And so we have to be smart. We have to use the philanthropic dollars to create the systems and the models, and then push for state and federal support that can keep these programs going longer, and use this moment to innovate, use this moment to come up with new models, to try out new things, to recognize that the existing failures in the system are now being magnified. And so as we look at places like food deserts in our, that are leading to all of these issues that Denise has mentioned, how can we start to address some of these inequities in our responses in the work that we're doing now, and push for some of these new models and systemic change, using those philanthropic dollars to pave the way forward, so we can really push for some longer term, larger support, because it's the only way we're going to be able to get through this in the long term.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks. Very insightful. And Denise, any final words on this question about how do we keep this conversation going?
So obviously all the audience members of today's webinar have an existing interest as regards to food insecurity and also relationship with funds for food. The challenge in terms of keeping the conversation or the opportunity is now, go find other people. The one common denominator that every human being has in this world is food. We have to have food, it's essential. So there's not anyone that that does not have an interest in eating every day. So recruit folks, increase the awareness, bring somebody with you when you go to the food banks, as you're fostering new relationships with food banks. And most importantly, please hold our elected officials accountable in terms of the political awareness and actions of food insecurities.
Thank you, Denise. Thanks very much. Olga, any last thoughts on this question?
Last thought. I genuinely believe, while we should have the most efficient way of getting food to the people who need, and it's hard to predict when people fall into this situation, I genuinely believe that we can reduce the number of people that we find in this situation if we have a systemic approach into education, to like government programs, not to just feed people, but actually address the root causes and really understand what brings people into this situation. Helping those communities that are underserved to blossom, to get better.
Thank you so much. And when it comes to bringing more people into the conversation, like Denise mentioned, I do believe this session is being recorded and will be available later onto YouTube. So please share it around and invite your colleagues to think about this question, your family members, your friends. Let's expand the network of people talking about food insecurity and really thinking about how do we overcome these challenges. So I really want to thank all of our panel members. I know I've kept you about 2 minutes over, but it's been a really fascinating conversation. I know from the questions coming in, I think it's been fascinating for our audience as well. So thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate the time that you're spent here today, but overall, the time that you're spending to really tackle these problems and to really bring this, what we call a real problem for humanity, and bring the awareness and bring the solutions. So thank you very much again. Thank you for your time. I'm going to actually now throw to Kay Rosnatsky, who's going to give a quick wrap. This is the last session of the seminars, so she will do a quick wrap for us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Millie, and thanks to our amazing panel for joining today. Kate and the Charity Committee selected 9 of the most innovative and impactful charities from across the world. Tonight we heard from 3 of them, but if you'd like any more information on how you can support these charities, please contact Kate, Sarah, or myself, or visit our website at fundsforfood.com. We'd like to thank everyone for their overwhelming support. We are so close to 2 million in donations raised and would be so grateful for any additional support to help get us there. Thank you all for a successful event.